Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Econ Americas podcast, where each month we'll share with you some under the radar investment opportunities from countries across the Americas, from Canada down to Chile. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and find us on all the major podcast platforms. By the way, Econ Americas is a startup research firm that provides financial and economic intelligence. You can learn more about us and our services at econamericas.com. I'm Daniel Duarte, editor at Econ Americas, and I'm based in Asunción, Paraguay. I'll be your host for this first episode where we want to make the case for investing in Latin America in 2021. To discuss this issue, I'm joined by Fergus Hodgson. He is the director of our firm, and he's finishing an MBA in finance at Rice University in Texas. But for many years, he headed a news outlet focused on Latin America, and he's also traveled extensively and lived in many countries across the region. How many, Fergus, do you even keep count of the countries?
I try to keep count down, but of course it gets very blurred. So I've been to 19 of 20, right? So there are 20 countries if you include Brazil and Puerto Rico. The only one I haven't been to is Bolivia, which I'm trying to get to sometime soon. But mostly I spent a couple of years in Guatemala and a year and a half in Argentina, and then extended stays in Colombia and Ecuador. And then of course, a few months in Paraguay. But many countries I've been to multiple times now. So Mexico, Peru, and
you learned Spanish, of course.
Yeah, I first started learning Spanish in Colombia and Ecuador back in 2010. And then I took formal lessons there, and I did the Duolingo course like everybody, and I clocked the system. So I did all the lessons. But my own view is that if you really want to learn the language, there's really no substitute for immersion. And I spent a lot of time in Argentina living among people who could not speak English. And that gave me a tremendous advantage in terms of learning the language. Still, it's a challenge to have all the technical aspects of the language. And I don't have anything like your level of bilingualism, unfortunately. But I mean, your level is more impressive, Dan.
Oh, but you're a man for the job, so we are lucky to have you.
Yeah.
A foot in both worlds. So, Fergus, I have to admit that for this episode, we have set up a difficult task for ourselves. Why should investors care about Latin America when so much news coming out from Argentina, Venezuela, even Central America has to do with poverty, crime, and government failure?
Dan, that's a great question, and I'm really glad to speak about this because, yeah, you and I know this concern intimately, right? We did work for years at a media outlet covering Latin America, and when you work in the media, you cover the most titillating or the gravest problems, and my concern is that can give people a confused or distorted view of what's going on the ground, and so. It is true that Latin America has had crises, particularly Venezuela and Argentina in recent times. There have also been coups in Peru, Bolivia, Honduras. So, we have had instability. But the big challenge with following the news is that you miss the slow news, which is the fact that this part of the world is going through an incredible development. And in fact, it's going through a development, in many cases, too quick for the local governments to handle. So people are getting modern technology, they're getting vehicles. When I first went to Colombia in 2010, there were still people riding horses in the middle of Bogota. And I miss those days, to be frank. I wish they would still be riding horses, but now you would never see that. So 10 years, what a difference it makes. And so the development has been rapid. In Guatemala and Quito, you see the level of ownership of vehicles as just one indicator of people having more first world standards as ballooning. And so they have to have all sorts of schemes to keep people off the roads because there are just too many vehicles. So so my concern is, yes, that we all know the instability. You and I were familiar with this. We're aware of it, and we are concerned about it. But following the media, you do miss the slow, good news. And in particular, your own country, Paraguay, is going through a long-term growth period, perhaps for the last 25 years or so, which has just been ignored.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. One of the positive aspects also of Latin America, I think, it's demographics. You have a very young population and high birth rates, which you don't have in other developed countries. So that's a good sign for economic growth. And while it's true that emerging markets are where this economic growth is going to happen over the next decades, and a lot remains to be done in terms of infrastructure, technology, and all the people who have to go to college, there's definitely money to be made there. But when investors talk about investing in emerging markets, they usually consider China, Indonesia, maybe Vietnam. They are looking at Southern Asia. So, what can you tell these investors who are seeking some competitive advantage or distinct features compared to these markets?
Yeah, sure. Well, I am from New Zealand originally. That's where I was born and where I grew up. So I maybe have more familiarity with Asia Pacific in terms of that background. They are different worlds, right? So let's say perhaps Latin America has more of the natural resource opportunity versus the service economies options, let's say in Singapore or Hong Kong. So what are the advantages to Latin America? I think the point you make about demographics is an important one, that the cost of labor is low and will remain low for a long time. So anyone wanting to set up manufacturing, or I mean, even just call centers in places like Central America are booming because of the low cost of labor and because you have a very America-oriented population. People are very aware of English and want to learn it. So the cultural barrier is less. Geographic proximity is obviously an advantage. And in particular, Mexico, of course, with NAFTA, is very much integrated into the US economy. And so I think there are many advantages, especially now during this COVID era. We're seeing the challenges with maybe the supply chains breaking and having that access. Also, for better and for worse, North America, we focus a lot on Canada, the United States, and integrating with Latin America is basically becoming a part of Latin America. So that the divide is much, much less. I mean, I'm in Texas, so we're basically part of Latin America already. And so I think the cultural barrier is much lower. And as you said, the demographics are much more favorable for long-term growth.
And you also have, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the most dollarized region in the world, because you have some countries like El Salvador and Ecuador who are that are run in US dollars. The economy is run in US dollars, so the central bank basically does not print its own currency. These countries have adopted the US dollar as their own currencies.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And then, so what can you tell our listeners about the asset classes that are available to them as investors? The region is known for its commodities and mining resources, right? And should invest in those, or maybe they should try equities, corporate bonds, maybe real estate. What are the options here?
Yeah, great question, Dan. And I want to just talk about the dollarization. Ecuador and El Salvador are a prominent example. So is Panama. But as you well know, if you bring US dollars cash, even to Asuncion where you are, taxi drivers would accept that, right? And they'll all know the exchange rate. So and in fact, we, in our writing, I think Paz Gomez has written in favor of more dollarization. So places like Venezuela and Argentina should just give up this insanity of inflation and realize that they don't have the institutional quality to protect their currencies. So they should just embrace dollarization. And I hope in the coming years, we'll actually have private currencies, alternative currencies that can take up that mantle, and we'll stop relying on the Federal Reserve as the de facto currency or de facto reserve currency. But moving on in terms of the different ways to go about it, there are many different ways, and this is why we exist, right? I mean, why we're passionate about at Econ Americas about learning the different ways to invest in Latin America in an intelligent fashion so you don't get fleeced. And there are many ways, depending on your risk profile. Probably the lowest risk way is to invest in a US or Canadian-based company that just does business in Latin America. So therefore, you can use the US or let's say the Toronto Stock Exchange, and these companies have already done all the risk assessments, they've already done all the local compliance, the legal problems. Everything is already worked out for you. And so, of course, they don't do that for free, but basically you get exposure to Latin America through a US or a Canadian-based firm, and without any of the real risks. And so Scotiabank is one example that it does heavy involvement in Latin America, particularly in Mexico, and there are many others like that. Now, what we're particularly interested in too is going further and looking at both stock exchange options and actual private equity alternatives in Latin America. So getting your feet, your hands dirty a bit more in the local financial sector. Mm-hmm. And many of these countries don't really have functioning stock markets. I hate to say this. If you look at Guatemala, there is a Bolsa Nacional or national exchange, but the fact is there's almost nothing listed there. So private equity is really the way to go, and that's where you really need more on the ground knowledge, and we're seeking to fill that gap. Now, one option which is rising, so the mining companies are a way to get exposure from US and Canadian-based companies, and then they actually do activity. So it's a bit higher risk because the mining itself is higher risk. So that's another option. But I'm particularly excited about real estate. You mentioned the demographic changes, and Asuncion has been known to be one of the most affordable capital cities in the world, right, in terms of living and buying real estate. But as you know, that's been going up like a rocket in recent years. So the demographics are leading to real estate opportunities, and Latin America has embraced REITs, real estate investment trusts. So there's a lot going on, and I'm excited about all these different options. But like I said, it depends on your risk profile and how much research you're willing to do. And if you don't want to do the risk, you don't want to have a high risk, and you want to have don't deal with the research or hire your own support, you can go with just Canadian or US firms that do business in Latin America and just invest directly with them.
Could Honduras host the next Hong Kong? Honduras, a low middle-income country in Central America, has put itself on the investment radar by launching unique jurisdictions allowing investors to create their own startup cities. Honduras Employment and Development Economic Zones, ZEDEs, inspired by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Romer's idea of charter cities, are territories with the authority to establish their own taxes, laws, courts, and regulations. Think of Hong Kong, a city-state with great political and legal autonomy from the rest of the country. The first Honduran ZEDE launched in May 2020 in Roatan, a 32-square-mile island and tourist destination in the Caribbean where locals speak both English and Spanish. Honduras Prospera, the firm behind the ZEDE, seeks to develop the island over the next decade by attracting $500 million in foreign direct investment and spurring 10,000 jobs by 2025. According to Ernst & Young, if successful, Roatan Prospera will become the 9th most competitive business location in the world. Although privately managed, Roatan Prospera is legally a municipality, so it must provide education, health, security, and infrastructure to residents. To relocate there, Honduras must pay a $260 annual residency fee and foreigners $1,300. Setting up a company in Roatan Prospera costs between $540 and $1,840, and its e-governance system streamlines the incorporation process. In addition, Roatan Prospera has established partnerships with leading companies around the world. Fiscal incentives are a major selling point. There are 3 main taxes: on income, on retail sales, and on land value. Most common permits cost between $50 and $200. After the emergence of Prospera, 2 other ZEDEs have seen light in Honduras, with different governance systems and goals: Mariposa and Morazan City. And this is just the beginning. If you want to learn more about Prospera and its opportunities, make sure to check out our show notes where we have included a link to a backgrounder by Econ Americas.
Yes, and I should point out there are some Latin American companies that actually are listed on US exchanges,
Right.
such as Mercado Libre, which is a version of a local Amazon in Argentina and the region.
Yeah.
It is listed on the US stock exchange, so you can get exposure to that business through the US market. So it's all and good, but we know there are many problems in Latin America to do business. As a Latin American myself, I know how hard it can be to set up a business, invest in companies, and some frustrations that, off the top of my head, are government bureaucracy and capital controls. How can investors who are new to this region navigate these issues?
Well, this is the whole point of doing your own research, because my fear is that people will go in without understanding these risks, and there is this illusion in Anglo or North America that places like Honduras or Central America are just, Ayn Rand havens for free market capitalism, which is ridiculous. You will actually read this in places like Salon.com, which are just deceitful. But as you say, the truth is that the only sense of lawlessness is just from incompetence in the bureaucracies, or the fact that there's so much violence that they're so distracted trying to resolve that they don't have time to enforce the broader regulations. Now, if you go in as a major formal company, though, you're going to have to comply. And one of my dear friends in Argentina says that that's what a lot of foreigners come into a place like Argentina. They don't understand that everyone locally is just doing work off the books, because they know that going the formal way is very difficult. So you really have to do your due diligence. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. And, like I said, we work in Latin America. We deal with these challenges all the time. And, whether it's compliance, you even did the note about the integrated market, the MILA, integrated market of Latin America, the stock market,
Yes.
in the way that, although it's, I guess, on paper or supposed to be integrated, the fact is that the bureaucratic barriers have made that nigh impossible. And personally, on an advocacy level, let's say we'll push for more either trade deals or trade liberalization of markets to make them more accessible to foreigners. In the meantime, you just have to realize you're dealing with a more complicated or different economic situation, and that there has to be a risk premium and let's say a compliance premium associated with that you won't go in unless you can get some higher return to justify it.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Yeah.
and the Pacific
actually,
Alliance.
I'll
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think one positive note about the trend toward free trade is the Pacific Alliance, which is it's not there, but a lot of countries are harmonizing their tax rules and their trade requirements. So I think this is a trend that is going to make trade with Latin America easier. So we should focus on these trade agreements with the Asia Pacific region, and these are going to boost trade. I'm sure about that.
Yep, I'm hopeful about that too, and especially with the leadership of Chile. At least historically, that has been more towards economic modernization, and it's obviously so desperately needed that the lack of capital, the lack of investment, is a glaring problem in Latin America. And any sort of ways to make this easier or more streamlined, it's a win from my perspective.
Right. So moving on, I wanted to discuss briefly what are some cultural differences that you notice from all your years, not only living in Latin America, but you also work with Latin Americans, and what are some of the differences that have struck you and continue to strike you?
Oh, Dan, there's so much to say there. And I should say too that I feel so lucky to have just incredible people to work with. And, I have 3 full-time and 3 part-time people working in our team, in addition to me. But I should point out that I fired a lot of people along the way. you have to be extremely careful whom you're going to put your trust in and select. And I mean, over the years, I've hired and fired dozens and dozens of people. And so now I have the very best people who are my trust and I have great confidence in to work with. Now, in terms of the cultural differences, there are many. And one of the challenges with conveying these is that people, I don't think, realize how profound these differences are, because they'll just go on a trip to Costa Rica and hang out in some resort city, or people will even go to Cuba and hang out in some resort. They have absolutely no idea of the way life is lived on the, for the regular people in those countries. And and there's just a big difference between vacationing somewhere and setting up business and making a long-term home. And I encourage people to really get a sense for what makes Latin America distinct, both good and bad. And I think the main issue that I have run into is the divided societies. So there is not a strong sense of a unified country. Paraguay is actually probably a bit distinct here. Paraguay has probably more national unity than most countries in Latin America. Maybe Uruguay would be another one. But in general, we see very divided societies along class lines, family lines. And I see that as something you just have to be aware of, that people will immediately try to place you in that hierarchy. And you just have to work with that most of these countries have a ruling oligarchy that is very tight. And often these oligarchies they'll be fighting with each other. And in fact, you'll see them basically change hands. But there is a ruling oligarchy and a more of a hierarchy, which I think is different from, let's say, Canada or New Zealand, where I grew up. Of course, we have our own problems, but the hierarchy is much greater. I grew up in a very middle-class society, and I don't think there's any Latin American country that has such a heavy middle class.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Even though the middle class is expanding a lot, Brazil may be the best example over the last decades. There still is a lot of economic concentration. So if you want to get down and do business in one of these countries, you have to deal with these oligarchs, as you say. But I think there are many up and coming entrepreneurs, vibrant hubs of innovation in many countries, in Chile, Panama, and Brazil as well. So there are opportunities that are, let's say, that have escaped or are trying to escape these dynamics. So these are very, very encouraging signs. So,
and just if I may just say something about the middle class there, Dan. Just quickly when people refer to middle class, I hate to say it, but middle class in Latin America is not what we would consider middle class here. So in a place like Guatemala, where I spent a good amount of time, the average salary of, let's say, a middle class or professional worker would be about $800 per month. So that really, to them, they feel like they're middle class when they get to that level. But of course, in the West, we would never consider that achieving middle class. But so that's the magnitude of the economic difference we're dealing with.
Yes, that's true. So if you were to pick a country to start researching and maybe invest in, which one would you choose and why?
Yeah, so I am excited about Colombia. Colombia has a special place in my heart. It was the first country I went to in 2010 to explore. But in terms of the economic prospects, there are many reasons why Colombia is somewhat of a diamond in the rough. And it's not dollarized. The country is not dollarized, but economically, it is much more stable than neighbors Ecuador or Venezuela. And even Panama is really in a difficult situation now because of all the dependence on, I guess, past banking or secrecy laws, which are now being undone.
Yes.
So why is Colombia? Colombia has great, not industry, I'm not saying, but great agriculture. It has the coffee trade. It has mining. It has the leather, let's say, it has textiles in Bucaramanga, and it has a nucleus or a nexus of expats, of Americans there, particularly in Medellin. So Colombia is exciting to me. I think Colombia is a growing country. It's going to become more open. Again, real estate is promising there. I'm excited about Colombia. And also, as you know, and anyone who studies Colombia knows that they've had basically a half century of internal warfare or guerrilla warfare, largely where you have narco-terrorists or drug-funded terrorists. And I'm not an advocate for using drugs, or I want to put that out there that I support liberalization of laws, but I don't support using it. But regardless, I'm just the situation is just that the liberalization of drug laws, which will cut into the premiums of these narco-terrorists, will dethrone them to some degree. And I think that's a wonderful advancement for Colombia, that the reduction in violence will just be a miracle, godsend for that country.
That's a great point, because many people may not know, but large swath of Colombia were under the control or dominance of these guerrillas or rebel groups. And with liberalization, I think a lot of these opportunities and will open up in many parts of the country that were previously under the control of gangs. So I think that's allowed to say there. Okay, to wrap this up and get done with our first episode, just want to encourage people to go to our website on econamericas.com. We have a lot of content on all these topics, so you can keep exploring there. But Fergus, please leave us with 2 book recommendations on Latin America so investors can better know the region.
Yeah, I'm spoiled for choice, because obviously it's been something that I've been reading about for so long. But 2 that I really like are Liberty for Latin America by Alvaro Vargas Llosa, the son of Mario Vargas Llosa. So he's a Peruvian who now lives in the United States. And it's a wonderful overview of 500 years of Latin American history, a very concise book. And then the other one is the collected writings of Jose Azell, so Reflections on Freedom. He is a Cuban exile, and he lives in Miami now, but travels a lot to different places. And the collected writings cover, they are his shorter articles, which cover all sorts of things, such as constitutionalism in Latin America, maybe the instability of the region, and investing, why that's not a good idea in Cuba, for example. So those are the 2. And if you want more of a red pill or more of a dissident book, Nicaragua Betrayed by Anastasio Somoza is the one to go with. It's somewhat ghostwritten or written alongside a journalist, but it's an incredibly important book for Latin American history or Central American history. And that's one I would leave you with. So Dan, thanks so much for letting me speak.
No problem. If I may, I'll leave my own recommendation, and it's a book about recent Latin American history. So if you want to know, for instance, about the pink tide that swept Latin American politics over the past 2 decades, there's a chapter about that in this book that's called Forgotten Continent, A History of the New Latin America by Michael Reed. He is a senior editor at The Economist magazine. So there's it's a revised and updated edition of a book that he published a lot of years ago. So there's a lot of content there for everyone who's interested in Latin America. So that's right, folks. Thank you for listening. And then you can subscribe to our website. You can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook. We're on all the major social media platforms. And please send us your comments, your recommendations, your suggestions, topics you want us to discuss and explore. So thank you, everyone, and see you next month.